Welcome everyone. You're listening to the ICA India podcast. Through the podcast series, we hope to bring out multidisciplinary dialogues by discussing the intersections of economics, policy, and cancer.
Welcome everyone. This is Smita Srinivas. This is the new episode of our ICA India project podcasts. This is the Innovation for Cancer Care in Africa project, and we are the India team with the great pleasure today of being joined by the CEO of STEER, which we'll hear a little bit more about, Mr. Janak Nabar, and with Dr. Dinar Kale, who is at the Open University in the Development Policy group. And both of them are a highly individual, strongly researched team members who are working together as well as separately. I've had the pleasure of working with both of them in different capacities, and it's a chance for us today to delve in a little bit deeper into the entire slightly mysterious and extremely important area of medical devices and diagnostics. Thank you, Janak and Dinar, for being here today.
Thanks, Smita. Thanks for having me.
As all of you know who are joining us today, the field of cancer research is complex. It involves many different kinds of sub-industries, subgroups, different kinds of firms, different kinds of capabilities. And so I want to start off with asking first Janak and then Dinar a little bit more about yourselves. What would you like our audience to know? And maybe a little bit about your organizations. I would like to also flag that Dr. Kale is an important member of our ICA team working from the Open University in the UK. Janak, let me start with you. What would you like our audience to know more about?
So I have been heading the Center for Technology, Innovation, Economic Research. I'll first start with talking about the center, then I'll come to myself. So the center is an independent think tank working to raise the level of awareness about the role of technical capability and R&D and innovation in economic development, and especially with respect to India. I think it's widely appreciated that countries that have seen sustained periods of high growth have invested a lot in R&D. And we felt that, there was a need for an organization like this to really focus on creating that awareness. I think people understand it and appreciate it, but really through data, through numbers, through research, inform and really raise the level of debate around these issues about what R&D and innovation can play, the role it can play in India's economic development. So we work with various stakeholders, the government, academic institutions, researchers like yourselves, young researchers who are looking to develop a career in the field of economics of innovation, and of course, policymakers and industry as well. You cannot leave any one of them out when you're really trying to get everyone together to discuss these issues. Some of the areas that we look at around innovation indicators in India, data around that, we're looking at some policy-focused research, starting with firm-level innovation. We've picked a sector, which is healthcare innovation. And we also study regional innovation systems, so largely like how different states are developing their innovative ecosystems as well. I have a small team based out of Pune. My own sort of background is in mathematics, then eventually moved into economics, primarily in the private sector in Singapore for a number of years as a private sector economist, and then moved back to India in 2014 to set this up. And, it's supported by the Forbes Marshall Group. The chairman of our center is Naushad Forbes, who, I think for a number of years had this vision of really setting up a think tank that would look at economics and economic policy. And so we've finally got this off the ground.
And working within the wider ecosystem of researchers is really an opportunity to understand not just new organizations in the country, looking at a wider landscape, but also chances individuals to figure out what it is that can be done in this space. Dinar, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Just for my background, I'm a senior lecturer in innovation and development at the Development Policy and Practice discipline at the Open University. So I'm a co-investigator in innovation for cancer care in Africa, which is the ICA project. focusing basically on the industrial side of the project. As far as my background concerned, I'm an organic chemist as to start with. Then I moved to the business studies, looking at the development of innovative technological capabilities in Indian pharmaceutical industry. And then I moved to development studies, and that's where I started focusing on medical devices and diagnostics and their role in sort of ensuring the affordable healthcare. My interest in medical device and diagnostics comes from my working experience in India. Before I went to UK for my PhD, I was working with the multinational companies, basically medical devices multinational companies, and I got the first-hand experience of the challenges of affordability and accessibility the Indian consumer faces while working with those companies. It was astronomical to see the profit margins of some of the MNCs because there were no local competitors. Specifically, something about my place where I work, the Open University, is one of the biggest distance learning providers in the world. It is pioneer in this field, and the development policy in practice, we've been involved in teaching postgraduate development studies for over 20 years now. And we are home to innovation in genomics institute called Innogenesis, which was funded by the UK government.
And one of the things I'm reminded by your response, both Janak and Dinar, is we also come from many disciplines. Although all of us collaborate together, it may be of interest to listeners to understand how multidisciplinary this space is. We often tend to think about this as specialists working, say, in industry or in R&D labs. But perhaps there's nothing quite as stark as the fact that the three of us here, along with Ojasvi, are all sitting and having this conversation.
I think that's the beauty of the subject. I mean, medical device and diagnostics, there is no one discipline involved in any of development. You get electrical knowledge, you need electronical software knowledge, you need biological, you need chemistry. And I think that's what also makes it more interesting to work with the team, as it's a cross-disciplinary area, which need a cross-disciplinary team to make good research.
I agree with that, Smita. I think it's important to shouldn't bracket ourselves into like economists or scientists, and an important subject like this really requires a multidisciplinary approach that may involve even intellectual property and lawyers and people who are familiar with trade policy, and so I think it has to really have an all-encompassing group of people that are thinking about these issues from a variety of angles. So I think that's the key here, really.
Ojasvi, do you want to leap in?
Yeah, so my first question is for Mr. Nabar. Can you tell us a little about some of your joint ongoing work on medical device innovation, your work and Dr. Dinar's work?
Sure, Jasvi. I'll step back and I think Dinar briefly mentioned how he got interested in the subject, but I think our conversation, especially with between Dinar and me, began perhaps 2017. And we were at that point, because as a center, we look at the data on R&D and innovation very closely, across different, not just what the private sector is doing or the government is doing, but also within the private sector. We track like what are the global R&D sectors, which where India has a presence, where is it that we're absent. It was very evident to us from very early on that while, of course, the pharma story is well known globally and India's competence in that, and if you look at the level of R&D spending and the intensity of spending, we match global standards. But if you look at medical device innovation, we don't have a single company out there which is on the global stage that is recognized for its R&D presence. We also, if you look at, for example, the level of spending on healthcare innovation and R&D in the government sector, you'll see that at least prior to the pandemic, the amount of spending that was being undertaken by, say, the Indian Council for Medical Research or even DBT, if you aggregated that as a share of your national R&D spending, or central government spending on R&D, it was hardly like 5 to 7%. Whereas if you look at many other countries like the US or UK, there's at least 20% of their central government R&D spending is towards healthcare innovation, right? So this got us thinking, and this was very early on with Dinar discussing, how can we expand this? We had already begun some work trying to understand what would it take to develop the ecosystem in India around medical devices. There are a number of very interesting statistics. If you look at, for example, India imports almost 80% of its medical device needs. If you look at the countries from where they largely import, would be maybe USA, Germany, Singapore. Very little that is actually being developed locally, and one would wonder, why is it something which the government or others are really not thinking deeply enough? So that's how Dinar and I got talking, and the work that we've been looking at, I would say, falls into really trying to develop maybe a framework to think about what it would take to develop an ecosystem for medical device innovation in India. So obviously it has required us to talk to people in industry, experts like Smita, many others who are thinking about this issue, even device manufacturers, right? So understanding what are their pain points, what is it that requires kind of support at critical stages, what are the barriers to innovation that many of them face, etc. So that's really where we're really focusing on to begin with. But then, through our discussions, we've seen there are many, many other interesting areas that need to be further looked at.
Follow-up question for Dinar, which is, you've been working within industry and you've also continued into academic work. Why is it taking us so long, given the urgency of some of these issues, to get to this sort of focus? Janak has brought up some of these tensions. What is so difficult about having these conversations?
As you mentioned in the beginning, Smita, the sector has a wide subsector. Subsector has a significant presence, but also that presence is much below the radar. Everyone focuses on drugs and vaccines, but how you diagnose the ailment, how you give a drug to a patient, those sectors always remain neglected. And I think one of the reasons which from my work I came across is there was a lack of collective or collaborative action. What I meant by that, there were no industry associations representing the medical devices until 2005. When I started my research and I asked the same question to those who were already working in the field, and they say we were so small that we remain under the radar. Second, the industry association or the industrialists or the entrepreneurs needed to educate the policymakers. And that process never happened in the past. For example, biotech has been really good example where there were some star entrepreneurs or innovators. They really lobbied with the government. The sector was termed as a sunshine sector. And it got lots of attention from the newspaper, business press, and the government. So it was really, for a politician to open a biotech park was really seen as a advanced science policy. But that never happened because those sort of star representatives from the medical devices section were not. And one of the reasons being, say for example, even if you are producing a thermometer, there are different types of medical knowledge is required. Which is very difficult to come under one category, So it needs a lot more comprehensive understanding of the product, and then that's how you set up the policy. Say that lack of industrial representation in the beginning, which should have, sort of educated the policymaker to the needs of the industry. The second, the complexity of the industry itself, which means it becomes challenging for the policymaker to set and requires a comprehensive understanding. And the third aspect is the lack of ecosystem, which is really, the medical innovation being a user-driven innovation, you need to have a very close relationship between the hospitals and the manufacturers. That's was lacking. And that's where that whole issue came, where the industry struggle for visibility and development.
So, question on what major challenges do we see in medical device innovation?
Just the need for better aligned policies across different domains. So to give you an example, if you're developing a mobile ECG machine, right, and you need to use maybe a smartphone now because you can get high resolution ECG printouts on that, and you can do away with, say, printers and thermal printers and papers which may get destroyed under extreme conditions or are expensive to maintain and things like that, which is a great idea. But if there is a certain, say, component of import duty on smart screens, or you raise the import duty of certain components that go into the manufacturing of these, what then tends to happen, and I think this is a problem that others have spoken of in the past too, about this inverted duty structure where, sometimes it's just cheaper to import like a whole machine than to sort of try and assemble it here and actually try and innovate and come up with something, right? So that is one thing, like where the cost may not, you don't really reap the advantage of that because you don't make those components here and then you have to import them. And because there are these duty structures, it affects the overall cost of your own innovation. Secondly, I would say is, when maybe public procurement rules are being framed, often innovators have said that there's a huge emphasis on specific parts as opposed to looking at the innovation in itself, right? And if the innovation has passed all the tests that it needs to, if it's got the regulatory approvals, they still may not qualify for the particular public procurement rules that are very part specific. So it's not about the functionality of the device, but it's about really the parts that are there. So again, getting these devices into the public system, if you have to, or a wider reach that potentially could be there, may not happen because of these rules constraining those devices. And thirdly, I'd say funding for a lot of the innovators. There could be funding at critical stages where sometimes devices take years to pass the regulatory approvals and tests that they need to undergo. And investors possibly shy away at points when is most important for these innovators. Maybe there are ways which private institutions or even the government could step in and say, look, at critical points, the facilities are there. We could make access to these facilities easier for these device manufacturers, give them enough support to get the necessary approvals, whether it's the FDA approvals or the CE recognition and things like that. So which, will definitely attract other investors later too. These are things which need to be thought through in terms of what level of handholding at what points are really important for an innovator.
But Dinar, could I follow up on this point? Because, at one level, Janak is correctly pointing out that, for the likes of all of us who are immersed in this sort of research, some of this seems, if not self-evident, then at least that there should be some priority ordering of things that are more or less urgent, or components or full products that could be imagined differently, whether it's customs, whether it's R&D subsidies, whether, there are certain kinds of policy instruments. But if we step back and say, is there a realm of medical devices and diagnostics where we don't need to think about innovation in the standard sense, but even a baseline criteria for minimum standards or minimum services and products? Is that a productive conversation? Is that somewhere we should go? Because there's a lot of debate about these. And I can imagine from a patient standpoint, this must be nonsensical at one level. These bottlenecks are so immense.
If you're referring to the issues of, say, regulations, I think that's one of the big area of discussion and debate and also improvement in Indian health technology industry's policy concern. The regulation has been really the weak side of the medical device, and as it's well publicized, until 2005 there was not much regulation, and then the Indian medical device regulation got entangled with the existing drugs regulation. The issue became where the devices, till the current regulation, the devices were sort of considered as the drugs, and both of them are totally different. It has a very wider implication for the industry, and I think that understanding has to be there. The regulation not only gives you the standard products, good quality products, but it also helps the industry to develop those skills or develop the capabilities, because then you are creating a guidelines, and these are the guidelines helps the learning within the firms. If you look at even the baseline level, as you mentioned, the setting up of those standards was very critical. And one of the reasons, again, why it's challenging for the policymakers to set up the regulation, because the complexity of the industry, and that's where you need industry associations to work very closely. The government, that has been the examples in other countries. The second issue is, the medical devices innovation is a very user-driven innovation, where the surgeons, the anesthetists, the nurse, They work very closely. They come up with the ideas because they are using the instruments. You will always find, for example, when I was working, basically the training or the product knowledge to given us by a nurse based in Singapore. And she used to tell us like how to use the catheter. These are the individuals which tells the companies, okay, why don't you modify the product in such a way? But that to happen, you need that close ecosystem relationship. And except say Sri Chitra Research Institute in Kerala, where there has been a good examples, as far as my research and understanding currently, that's the only place where I know where they have a biomedical wing attached to the hospital. And now there is a lot of corporatization of hospital, and there is a scope in Indian case where these sort of relationships can be developed. In terms of challenges, so I just to add the procurement, finance, trade policy, I would say regulation policy, and the lack of this close ecosystem of innovation. These are the further makes it complicated in Indian context to develop the medical device innovation.
But is it, for example, Janak, I mean, I'm thinking of the experience of patients. In our ICA project, some countries are focused on patients. The India project is really focused on what we thought was a missing link around industry regulations, industry, even the framing of the medical device and diagnostics industry. But Janak, do you think user-driven innovations, and the users may be multifold, right? They may be the patients themselves, they may be surgeons, they may be other skilled medical personnel, they may be a whole bunch of people in the Indian context or some of the other ones in which you have worked, that you think we are missing a fundamental set of human relations through which we view improvements in design? What is it that is missing here?
Even if you leave medical device innovation aside, very early on when the pandemic struck, there were numerous reports about the lack of beds, shocking numbers about like the infrastructure, the state of our health infrastructure and all of that basic kind of requirements that are needed, right? And one has to ask, like, why is it that when we know that there is a clear demand for healthcare, we should be thinking about in a country like ours about accessibility, affordability. That should be at the core of like the way we think about growing this industry also, right? And accessibility through like medical device interventions, like use case that Dinar was talking about. It's very, very important because, there are numerous cases where we've studied how devices may have been timely in ensuring that, you catch a ear problem very early on as opposed to when, it being too late, or you catch anemia in women when, it just goes undetected. And usually it's women and children who perhaps get left out in many of these cases, right? And if we really have to make that effort to be inclusive and ensure that we provide like access and affordable healthcare to as many of our people, then I think they need to be at the center of like the way we design our policies. And I think if you put that at the center, then perhaps you'll start thinking about, how do I create the right device? How do I create the right ecosystem for that? How do I create the right policies to make sure that it actually gets to the people who need it the most?
Dinar, do you want to add anything to that?
I know, I think Janak has captured it really well in terms of even if you look at the pharmaceutical industry, India has been the pharmacy of the world. We have been really supplying but in Indian case, even if we have such a successful pharmaceutical industry, but the health access to those medicines for the poor population is still a big challenge. And I think there are some steps taken by the government in terms of those insurance schemes and those new schemes about it. We need to bring that into the focus where the consumers, the poor and low-income consumers, become the focus of the policy, where the access should be even the industry and in the medical device innovation. And there are some examples where some of those innovators and entrepreneurs are really thinking about those devices in terms of how they can improve the accessibility. So there are green shoots, as we can say, where there has been new examples where the startups are really focusing on those, creating those accesses. But I think that should be the focus of the policy at the government level.
Well, Thank you both. And to the audience, thank you for sticking this out with us. So with big thanks and hope for the next conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the ICA India podcast. Do follow our social media handles and stay tuned for the next episode.